Back to a new video. So this video is about Jetpack Compose and different concepts of Jetpack Compose and how they fit all together. So we're going to build a real-world application. So this video is packed with a lot of information. So remember to watch it till the end in order to get every concept. So without any further ado, let's see what we're going to build. As you have guessed, we're going to build a food ordering application. So this application is having a lot of features. So the first features which we're going to have is the splash screen and also the onboarding screen. So whenever you open up your application for the first time, then you're going to get this screen here, which is going to walk you through the application. So we have this cool design here, and basically we can easily scroll by using a view pager in order to scroll to a different page. And here you can see we have also another delivery page. And also we have the welcome page where we have the button to get started. And here we're using animations to show this button here. As you can see, this button is going to be hidden whenever we are not on this particular page. So for now, if we reach this page here, we can click get started in order to get started. And here is the application, and you can see we have different aspects. And we have popular foods and also food here. Okay, so the application here mainly have two tabs. As you can see, we have the home tab and the cart tab. And the home tab here contains a simple snapshot of the informations which we have inside the application. And we're using custom fonts. For example, here you can see we are using a custom font. And whenever here we have something, for example, if we want to view it, we can just click here. Then we can just go to a detailed page. And inside here, a detailed page, we have a cool animation. As you can see, this image is going to go up here and have a different type of alignments and other things. So we are going to learn through this video and see how we can achieve this particular feature. And here we can just click back. And you can see we can, for example, navigate inside here our cart. And here we have several items which we have added. And basically here, for example, whenever we change here, you can see our price also is going to change because we have changed the quantity here also. And we have different type of data which we're going to have. So basically we are going to use static data for these particular purposes because we are learning about Jetpack Compose and how we can connect everything together. So without any further ado, let's get started. Okay, so before we start to write any type of code, let's get first the initial project structure and see what we have added here. So there are several things which I have changed through this initial project, and you can easily get it through my GitHub, and the link is provided in the description. So the first case here inside I have added several datas which are going to help us to get started. So the first case here I have added these models which are just the static datas which we have. So for example, we are going to have the filters, which we can easily just use them to filter our database and display this. The next case here is the food collections. So we have different types of foods. So you can see here we have the food collections and also the repository, which is just a fake repository to mimic getting data through an API or our own data sources. So for this case, we're just going to use this, and this is just because we are learning here. The next case is we have the static data for different types of functionalities which you are going to have. So you can just examine it yourself. The next case here is we have the food items and the list of the foods which we are going to have. So I have been sourcing the image through Unsplash. So you can easily just get different images and use them inside here. So I have added several of them in order to get us started. The next case is I have changed here is our color. And I have got here a different color scheme, and you can easily generate this by using a material theme generator. So you can just Google this material theme generator and actually export the colors to Jetpack Compose, which you can get here. So I have defined custom colors in order to use it and change the theme here. As you can see, our theme is actually changed here, and we can use it directly inside our theme. The next case here, I have added a Pacifico font, which is the font which you're going to use it as our custom font. And you can easily get this through Google Fonts, download it, then you can easily add it here. As you can see, I have a separate folder for fonts, which is just this Pacifico font. And after that, then you can easily use it by using this font here and access it. It's really easy. So another case here is inside our values, I have added several types of strings here, and you can see these are going to help us whenever we are writing our application. Now, the next important thing here is the dependencies which we have, and we have several dependencies I have added here, and we'll keep adding them. Okay, let's navigate here inside our module app, and you can see we have several dependencies, and now we are using a library catalog, which is just easy to implement it and add it here. And by using Android Studio, Iguana, by default you have to use this, and basically you have to declare here inside the library. As you can see, we have this folder here, libs.version, and inside here is where we are defining all of the dependencies and their versions which are listed here. So you can easily just get the initial project and get you started. So without any further ado, let's get started. You're going to build this up in steps. So we're going to start first with the home page, which is just going to be our feed. So for this case, we're going to start with this page and then iterate to other pages. Okay, so for this case, let's go inside here our UI and let's create here a new package. And for this package here, we can just call it home, where we're going to pass in our home data. Okay, so for this case, let's create a new coding class, and basically let's call this. Okay, now let's create here a new composable, and for this case here we can just call this feed. Okay, so here we have two variables. So on food click, so whenever a food item is going to be clicked, then we're going to invoke this, which is going to return us with the unit. Okay, the next case here is, let's pass in here a modifier, and this is just an empty modifier which we can easily use. Okay, so the first case here is to get the collection. So for this case, we can get our food collection, and here we can use a remember to help us to keep track of this in order to avoid different aspects here. Okay, so inside here, remember, we can use our repository. So we can just call here our food repository. And similarly here, we can get the filters. So we can just call here our food repository and call get filters. And basically now we have here our two datas which we're going to use. So the next case here, I want to create a private composable that we can use inside here. So let's just create a little room here. So the first case, we want to get the food collections. So this is just going to be a list of food collections that we can easily get. The next case is filters. And here we have on food click, which we can use whenever we click. And let's pass in here a modifier that is going to be crucial in order to manage our UI better. So for that case here, I want to create a surface. And inside here, we want to take the whole size, so we can use our modifier and give it max size. And inside here, we're going to have a box that is going to contain all of our data, which we're going to create. So the first case, we want to create a food collection list, and that is just the collection of the food which we're going to have. Then we're going to have the other case, which is just the destination bar and other things. So for this case, let's start with the food collection. So let's just go below here. Okay, now let's create here a new composable, and we are going to call this food collection list. The first case, we can get here the food collections, also the filters. Okay, now let's create here, for example, a state that is going to check if filters are visible. So if we want to show and expand our application to show filters, then we can use this. So we can call here our remember savable. That is the grid part. So with the remember savable is going to help us to track this even if we have configuration changes. So if a user rotates the device, the remember savable is going to keep this across the configuration changes, and it will not be reassigned for this case. So we can just call here mutable state of, and basically by default we can just give it false in order to not show anything. Okay, now let's just import these variables here. Okay, so for this case, let's create a box, and basically here we can just give it the modifier, which is just going to help us to contain all of our data inside here. The next case, I want to create a lazy column, because as you can see, our data is scrollable whenever we scroll around here. So when you go here, you can see that our data is actually scrollable. That's why we are using here a lazy column. Okay, so let's start with the first item. And inside here, we want to create a spacer that is going to help us to contain our data. So for this case, let's create here a spacer. Okay, so the first case, we want to give it a window insert top height in order to help us to avoid cropping the data beyond our view. And for this case here, we can just use this top height, and what we can do is use the Windows insert, and we have here our status bar, and we want to add here. So what we want to add here is padding, and we can just call here our Windows inserts, and basically what we want to do is to add only at the top. And for this case, we can just give it 56 dp, because this is the space of the top-up bar. So basically, we can easily avoid cropping any data that is going to go beyond there. Okay, so the next case here, which I want to do is to add this filter button here. So you can see we have this filter button, and also we can easily change this filter and add other things. So let's do this. So basically how we can easily achieve this is we can create here, for example, in order to organize our data better. So inside here, let's just create components. And inside our components here, let's create a new file. And this file here, we can just call it filter. Okay, now I want to create here a filter bar, so we can just call this filter bar. And here we're going to have a list of filters. And this is just going to be a list. And the next case here is on show filter. So if you want to expand this to a more generic one where a pop-up window is going to show up in order to apply other filters, then you can use this. So for example, here we have this on show filters, and we can have a state there which is going to be controlled. Then we can change and show a certain type of filters here. Okay, so as you observe here, you can see that our data is actually scrollable, and we can easily scroll here. And this is just horizontal scroll, and that a grid candidate for this is just a lazy row. So let's create here a lazy row. And I want to customize some things here. So the first case here is the vertical alignment. So let's change the vertical alignment, and we want to align everything center vertically. Also the horizontal arrangement, I want this to be spaced in a different way. So here we can use arrangement dot. And we want to use this spaced by in order to space it, and we want to use 8 dp in order to space the data. Okay, let's give the content padding, and here we can use the padding values in order to give it. So let's call here padding values, and this is the function. So at the start, we want to give it 12 dp. And here also we can just give it 8 dp. Okay, lastly, let's pass in here a modifier. Okay, let's give here the minimum height. So this one is just the height, and basically minimum. So we can just give it 56 dp. Okay, so the first case here, let's create an item in order to display that particular item. Okay, so here we have an icon button. And this basically is the button which we are going to see here. So you can see this button here, so we have to show it. So we can use just an item. Then we can use a list for all other filters which we have. So inside here we have the on click. Now let's create the button which we have. So we can use a surface here. Now to customize this, let's pass in here modifier. Okay, so one thing which I want to create here, as you can see inside here we have like a gradient. So here we have a bright and then here we have a dark one. So we can create here a gradient parameter that is going to help us for achieving this. And this is just going to be a modifier extension function. So let's create here a new function. Let's just call this gradient. Okay, now let's create here a function. And this function is going to be an extension function of a modifier. So let's use here our compose modifier. Then we want to call this, for example, diagonal gradient border. And here basically we want to get colors or a list of colors which we're going to have. So let's pass in here, which is just going to be a list of colors. The next case here is the border size, which this is just a dp, and by default we can just give it 2 dp. And lastly is giving us the shape, so we can use a different type of shape in order to customize this. Okay, so for this case here we are just going to use the border because we are extending here the modifier. We can easily use here this dot border, and on the part of width, we can just pass in here the border size. And on the part of brush, now we can create here a linear brush. That is just a linear gradient, and we can pass in here the list of colors in order to change that. Now let's pass in here the shape. And we can just give it a shape. Okay, so we have here a diagonal gradient. Now the next case, let's just go back inside here our filters, and we want to change it back. Okay, now let's just call here our new extension function which we have created. That is just a diagonal border. So for this case, let's pass in here the list of colors. So for the gradient, we can just pass in here a list of, for the first case here, we have the caramel. So we can use here the caramel 40, and also, okay, another case here is to pass in here the shape. And here we can just call our circular shape in order to make it circular. Okay, so we have here our view. The next case, we can just pass in here the icon. And here we can just call filter list. Okay, so we have here the item, and the next case, and lastly, let's pass in here the items. So for the part of the items here, we can just pass in the filters. Okay, so let's create here a chip that is just a filter chip which we can use. So for this case, let's just create here below a new composable that is just going to be a filter chip. Okay, so here we are going to receive a filter, and the next case here, let's pass in here an empty modifier. And another case is the shape, and for a case we can just use here by default. let's use a smallest shape inside our material theme. Okay, so the next case here, we can just destructure our state. So we have the selected, and here set selected, which here we can just call here our filters. Okay, so another case, as you can see, when you observe here, when we click, we have like an animation that is going to take out. And also whenever we do this, it's going to fade in and fading out. So we can easily animate the background color by using different animation states. So for this case, let's create here a background animation. So we can just call this background color. And we want to use animate color as the state here. And basically we can just target the state and see how we can easily achieve this. So let's pass in here an if statement. So the first case, if the item is actually selected, and we can use the primary color be here. And if it's not the case, then we can just pass in here another color. So for a case, we can just pass in here material theme, and we can use service variant in order to achieve that. Okay, the next case here, we can just add the label. So let's press add enter in order to add the label. So here we can just call BG color. Another case here, I want to animate the border which we are getting here. So you can see we have a certain border here. This border is animating between colors. And for this case, we can create another extension modifier inside here, our gradient. Okay, so here we are going to use a composed, and this composed here is going to help us to keep track of a state and actually maintain a component specific state. So basically here we're going to add a state. So you can see the difference here. We are just using directly the border without using composed. So composed is going to help us to keep a state inside a modifier. And for this case, for example, we want to animate the color. So we can just call here animated color. And this is just going to be a list of colors. So let's just create here a list. And our list is going to be of colors which we have colors.size. And inside here, for example, we are going to receive our index. So inside here, our index, we can easily just animate the color state. And here basically we can check if we have to show the border, then we can call here our colors. And we want to select that particular color at the index. And else if this is not the case, then we can show a different color. So for this case, we can just call here colors. And we want only to decrease the opacity, so we can just call here .copy, and basically the alpha is going to be 0.5f. So for this case here, we can easily animate it. Another case, we can just pass in here the label. Okay, so we have here our animated color. So for this case, we can just use our diagonal gradient border, and here basically we can pass in here the colors, border size and shape as how it is. So we can just go back here to our filters and create here our fading gradient border. Okay, now let's create here our border, and here basically we can just call our modifier and call here fade in gradient border. Okay, so we can show here our border. And we want to check if this is not selected. Basically, you have to show the border. And if it's selected, then don't show a border. Okay, now we can pass in here the color scheme. And the colors here, we are just going to use a caramel 40. And also we can use our primary light. which we have this particular color here. And for the shape, we can directly get the shape which we have. Okay, the next case is the color of text. So you can see the color is going to be different whenever it's selected and not. So if it's selected, then the color is different, and if not selected, then the color also is different. So for this case, we can create an animation for this. Okay, so we can use here the color scheme, and we want to use on primary color in order to differentiate this. And if it's not selected, then we can use the material theme, and we can call on surface variant. So this one is going to help us to keep track even of the theme, because we can have a different theme here. So here we can just call this text color, and this label is going to be useful whenever you want to debug your animations and you can see them easily. So for this case, let's create here a surface. Okay, let's customize this first. We have to pass in here a modifier, and we can just give it this simple modifier. The next case is the color. So we already defined here our background color and the content color, and we can use the text color to define our content. And the shape, also we can use the shape. And lastly, we can just show here a shadow elevation, and we can just give it 2dp to get that elevation. Okay, so the next case here, we want to get the interaction sources. So let's create here interaction sources. You can use here a remember in order to keep track of this interaction. So for this case, we can create here immutable interaction sources. Okay, so we have here our interaction source. The next case is the pressed. So we want to get that pressed interaction. So we can just call this pressed, and we can use here by delegate to access this directly, because this is the state now. So we can call interaction sources, and what we want to do is to collect is pressed as a state. So we can get this particular interaction source. Okay, so the next case is to change the background if this particular is going to be pressed. So for this case, we can just call here background. Now we can use an if statement. So if this is going to be pressed, so we are going to get here a Boolean value. Then actually we can create here a modifier with a different type of gradient. So for this case, let's create here another modifier. And this modifier we have not yet created. So let's go to our gradient here. Now inside here our gradient, let's create another composable. And inside here, let's use our modifier. And what we want to do is to call this offset. And here basically we're going to receive a list of colors. And the offset is also going to be a float. So how we want to offset this? Okay, so this one is going to directly be the background. Okay, so we want to use here a brush. Okay, we can use here a horizontal gradient now, and we can pass in here the colors. Which is just the effect of this. So we can just get the width. Then we can subtract with the offset in order to get that particular and X. And the last case is we can pass in here the tile mode. Okay, so here it's going to define the algorithm if we want to mirror, or we want to, for example, repeat that particular. So we want to mirror it. So for this case, if that gradient is going to end at a particular point, then it's going to mirror it going forward. Okay, let's just go back here inside our filters. Now for our modifier here, we can just call here offset gradient background, and let's pass in here the colors. And here let's use our caramel 40 and primarily light. So you can change it to different case. Okay, so let's go for 200F. And also for the offset, we are just going to go with 0F. Okay, now if we have this, then else, if this particular is not going to be clicked, then we can just pass in here a normal modifier with the background. So let's just use here another modifier. Let's pass in here a background. And for background, we can just pass in here color. And we can give it a transparent background for this case. Now let's create here a box that we can keep everything inside here. Okay, the next case here we can use the toggleable, which we can easily toggle our particular item here. So for the part of the value, let's pass in here the value, and that is the selected item. So if this is going to be selected and the on value change is actually changing that particular item, so we can just call here set selected, and this one is going to change it. Okay, let's give it the interaction sources. And we have already created our interaction sources. Let's pass in here the indication. And for the part of indication, let's just pass in here null for this case. Then we can combine here this modifier by using a then combiner here. So if we have this, then we can just pass in here the background pressed, which is just a dynamic one. And this is the grid part with Jetpack Compose. You can easily pass them dynamically depending on a certain condition. Okay, so we can just call here then. And actually here we can add another modifier, and that is just the border. The border modifier. Okay, so after that we can just open up here and let's pass in here the text. Okay, so for our text we can just call here filter.name. Then we can change the style. Let's use a small typography, so we can call here body small. Okay, and we want this to have a max line. And lastly, let's give it a padding. So horizontally, we are going to give it a padding of 20 dp and vertically a padding of 6 dp, which is going to be sufficient. Okay, so we have here our filter chip. We can just go directly inside here our items, and inside here now we can just call our filter chips and pass in here the filters. So let's just pass in here the filters, and everything is looking perfectly. So now here we have our filter bar, and basically now we can easily just call this. Okay, now let's go to our feed here, and below the spacer here we want now to call our filter bars. So for this case, let's just call here our filter bar. And here basically now we can pass in the filters which we have. So we have here the list of filters, and that is going to be here. And if we want to change the filters visible, basically here, for example, whenever we click this, we can show up the filter, and we can easily just use this here. Okay, so now here we have our item. Let's create now the list of particular items which we have. So we have a collection, and basically we can easily create it. So for this case, let's create another one, which is just items indexed. And the item indexed here, we can pass in a list. So for this case, we can just pass in here the food collection. And for a food collection here, we can pass in here the food collection. And actually here is just the collection which we have. So we can just call here food collection. Okay, so we can check first if the index is going to be greater than 0. Basically, this is just not the first item. So we want to show here a divider. So let's create here a divider. And we can give it a thickness of 2 dp. So after that, we want to create a food collection. Okay, so for this case here, let's create a separate composable. So let's just go inside here, components. Let's create a new component, and this is just going to be food. Okay, let's create a new composable. Let's call this food collection. Okay, so above here, I want to create several variables which are going to help us. So let's create here a private variable. Okay, let's specify here a get function. So for this case, we can use here our highlighted card padding width. So we can use here our width, then we can add up with the padding. And we want to convert this to pixel. So to combine everything, so we can get here our density. Okay, so we have here everything. Let's create a little room. So we can get here the food collection. Let's call this on food click. And whether this particular item is highlighted. So by default, this is going to be true. Okay, so now let's create here a column to hold everything. Now let's change here the modifier, and we can give it that default modifier. Okay, so now here we want to create a row that contains a header and also the back button, and also which we can use to navigate to other places. So for this case, let's create here a row. So a row here is going to arrange things horizontally differently from a column. Okay, so we can change here the vertical alignment in order to align it differently. So we can use here alignment.center vertically. And the next case here is we can pass in here the modifier. Now we can use here a modifier and give it a height in, which is going to give us a minimum height. So we want this to get a minimum height of 56 dp. And after that, we can pass in here a padding, and we want to give the padding at the start. So let's give it a start padding, and we can make it 24 dp. Okay, so after we set up here our row, the next case is to provide our text. And here we can just create here new text. So for this case, we can use here our food collection, and we want to use the collection name because this collection name here. So just navigate here. You can see we have the collection names, and also we have the food items which are going to be listed below here. So for this case, let's continue. And we can change the style of this particular one. So let's just use a material theme. Let's give it a headline small in order to change it. And also we want to change the font family. So we already created our custom font. So we can use here a Pacific font in order to use this custom font. Other than that, then we can change the max line. And we want only to have a single line for a heading and not multiple of them. Then we can change the overflow. So if we have a longer text, then we want to actually show an ellipse because we are going to have a detailed screen for that particular one. So here we can pass in here modifier. Now another case here is to give it a weight. So a weight here is going to help us in distributing the spaces and allowing that not other particular components to be pushed out of the screen. So by specifying a weight is going to help us with that. So another case, we have to wrap content width, sorry, not height. We want to wrap the width, and we want to align it to the start. And for that case, we have here our text. Now we can create here an icon button, which can be used to navigate. Okay, so to align a child, you can use non-align modifier in order to align it differently. So for case we want to align it to the center vertically, so we can just call here alignment center vertically. So this one is going to deviate the purpose of this one here. Okay, so now let's pass in here the icon with the image vector. So we can just call here icons.default. Sorry, we can call here auto mirrored in order to create an auto mirrored icon, which can be different from, for example, when we have a left to right layout and right to left layout. So it's going to be auto mirrored depending on that particular type of layout. And then here we can use default. Then we want to use the arrow forward. And here for content description, we can just pass in null and keep everything organized. Okay, so now we have our heading and everything is looking perfectly. So the next case here is looking about our actual display of foods that we're going to have. So basically we're going to have two types of this, the highlighted one and the normal one. So for this case, we can easily check. So we can use here, for example, if this is going to be highlighted, and then also we have to check also if this is going to be, and if this inside the food collection, actually the type of this food collection is going to be collection type highlight. So if this is the case, then we can show here a food item, and else we can just show a normal food item. So for this case, let's create here a highlighted food item. So let's just go below here. Let's create a new composable. So we have here the highlighted food items. Let's pass in here parameters. Okay, so the first case here, we want to get the state of the row. So we can create here a row state. And this is just a lazy list. So we can call here remember lazy list state. Okay, in order to get this, we can use here a width in order to get the actually the density. So we can call here local density dot current in order to get this. Then we can directly go inside here. So we can call here our card width padding. Okay, so essentially this code here is going to help us to convert between pixel and density, that is just dp. So if we want to convert this, we have to use this with context. For example, here we have this local density, which is just the current density which we have. So for example, if we are converting from pixel to dp and px, that is going to be really easy in order to not get weird errors and weird outputs. So this one is going to help us for that conversion. That's why we're using here with context, and basically we're providing dp and we want px or pixels. So for this case, we can easily convert this by using these local densities here and by providing the card width. So that's essentially what we are doing here. So in our food item, what we want to achieve is that each item has a certain type of background, that is just the gradient background. So we can easily calculate this by using a scroll provider and also using the offset. So for this case, let's just start by doing this. So we can create here a scroll provider. So this one is going to help us to calculate the offset. And for this case, whenever we scroll from one position to another position, then we can get this particular value. So this is just a lambda function. So for this case, we want to get the offset from start. Okay, so we can get here the card width with padding, and basically we want to multiply this with the row state. And we want to get the first visible index. So we combine here between the width and the first item index. So based on this, we can apply the offset differently. So let's just rename this typo here. Okay, so we get the offset from start. So we can return here the offset from start. Then we can just get here a row, which is going to give us the scroll. So we want to get the first visible scroll offset. So by adding this and combining this, we can get the desired effect which we are going to get. The next case here is getting our gradient. So we want to create a dynamic gradient that is going to be smooth. So for this case, let's create here a gradient. Now we are going to use here a when statement. So for this case, we can just get the index, and this index, whenever we divide this by 2, and we want to use here a ternary operator or a remind operator, that is going to help us to differentiate between variables that are not divisible by 2. And for this case, we can just get it. And here we want to get the odd, and that is just really simple algorithm. So if you know it, it's just a simple one to get between even and odd numbers. So that's what we are doing. So if the answer is going to be 0, then we can give it a different set of gradient which we have. So for a case, we can just use here orange 80. And else, if this is not going to be divisible by 2, then we can just return a list of different ones. So here, instead of starting with orange, so we can start with caramel 80. Then let's go with caramel 40 to create a different one. And let's pass in here orange 40, for example. Then go into a darker shade of orange. So this is just differently, so you can just go with a different one. Don't feel free to experiment with different types of these. After that, let's create here a lazy row to display our items. Now we can pass in here the state, and that state is just the row state. So whenever we scroll, we are going to get this. Let's pass in here modifier. Now let's pass in here the horizontal arrangement, and we can use here the arrangement. And we want to space it with a 16 dp. Let's pass in here the content padding, and we can pass in here the padding value. Okay, for the part of start here, we can give it 24 dp. And we can just give it 24 dp also. Okay, so after that, then we can create an items index in order to get the index of this particular item. So let's create here items index. And here basically now we can just pass in here the food items. And here we can get the index, and here let's just call this food item. Okay, now let's create here a highlighted food item for this case. Let's create here another composable. Let's create a private function. Okay, so we want to pass in here the food items. The next case is the on food item click. Okay, so this one is a lambda function which is going to return us with a float. And lastly, let's pass in here a default modifier. Let's create here our card. Let's pass in here modifier. Okay, so width here. So we can just call here our highlighted width. Let's give it a height. And that is just going to be 250 dp. And lastly, let's give it a padding. And give it a bottom padding. That is just a 16 dp. Okay, so after that, let's create here a column. Then we can pass in here a modifier. For this case, let's make this clickable. And we can just call here on food click. And basically we have the food item, and we can just get the ID here and pass it. And lastly, let's pass in here fill max size in order to take up the whole width of this particular item. Okay, so after that, let's create here a box. That is going to be a container. And we want to give it a set of height. So we can give it height. Okay, so another case here, I want to offset the background, but we want to use also the offset background here. So for now, we are just using here these. So let's just create here a new function, which is just the modifier here. Actually, in this modifier is not supposed just to be a composable. Okay, so instead of passing here a float, what we want to do is to use a density instead of that. That density is going to return a float. So we can just call here density. These are just lambda functions which we have. So we're going to have here a density that we can just return it here. Okay, so instead of using directly here a background, I want to create a separate thing here. And we can use draw behind, which is just a function that is going to give us the canvas API in order to access this and draw our modifiers here. Okay, so with this case, we can just get the actual offset. So let's call this actual offset. Okay, so for this case, we can call here draw rectangle, which is going to draw us with the rectangle. Now we can just pass in here a brush, and we want to pass in here the horizontal gradient. Okay, so let's pass in here the colors. Let's pass in here the start X, which now we can just use the actual offset, negative the actual offset, and end X. And actually minus with the actual offset in order to get the end type of this. Okay, so for the tile mode, we can just give it tile mode mirror, similarly as how we did there. So we have here our offset background. Now let's go back to our food items here. So now we can call here our offset gradient background. Now let's change the colors. And for our colors, we can just pass in here the gradient, which we have. Okay, so we are going to pass in here lambda function. So we're just going to use 6 times card width. Okay, so what I want to do here is to get this one. So let's just press Ctrl C. And we can paste it here because now it's just thinking that we are using another one. So let's pass in here another offset. Okay, so with the offset here, let's get first the left one. Okay, so we can call index. So based on that particular index, then we can multiply this with card width padding in order to get that padding. So for that case also, let's create here our gradient offset. So we can easily use here our left. Then we want to accompany with the scroll provider. So we can just understand here our scroll provider. Then we can just divide this with 3F in order to get this. And after that, then we can just pass in here our gradient offset. Okay, so basically what we are doing here is we are creating a width. And this width, we are taking 6 multiplying with the card width. So basically here we want to ensure that the gradient is extending beyond actually its particular width. And this is going to create us with the smooth scrolling effect. And that's why we here inside our offset, basically we want to get the left offset. In order to get this left offset, then we have to accompany the index of that particular item together with the card padding. So for this case, whenever we combine this, then we are going to get the left offset. Now after that, then we can get the gradient offset between these items in order to create a smooth scrolling effect. So for this case, we are going to use this left. Then we have to accompany this with the scroll provider. So the scroll provider is going to be aware of that particular position. And for this case, we have defined this scroll provider previously there using the lazy column state. And basically we get here the scroll provider, and we want to ensure that we have this divided by 3 in order to create that smooth transition like a dynamic scrolling gradient, which you're going to see. So this is evident. So let's just go inside here. And you can see here now we have here our items. Now whenever we scroll here, you can see like something is moving and creating a smooth gradient throughout our application, moving from different colors to different colors depending on the scroll position and the offset which you're going to set. So with this particular calculation is going to help us with that. Okay, so the next case here is we want to create now the image here. And this image can be easily positioned inside here our box. So for this case, let's just go beyond here and create a new composable that is going to be the food image. So let's create here a composable. Okay, let's pass in here the parameter, the image URL. Okay, so to create our image here, I'm going to create a surface. Okay, let's change the color of this particular surface. Let's use a light gray here. Let's pass in here the shadow elevation, which is just the elevation which we have there. And the shape, we can just call here circular shape. In order to gain that circular shape, let's pass in here the modifier. And we can give it an empty modifier. Okay, so here we are going to use coil for loading the image because we are using here an HTTP call. So for this case, we can just call here a model. And inside here, let's call our image request. Okay, so for there, we can pass in here the data, which is just the image URL. And the next case here, we can pass in here the crossfade. And this one is going to be true between the fading from the data which we have the placeholder. And here we can pass in .build. Now the next case here, we can pass in here the content description. So content description, which is just the content description which you're going to have above there. Now we can pass in here a placeholder. So you can pass in any type of placeholder which you have. So let me pass in here a painter resource. So for my case, I'm going to use r.drawable. And let's use a placeholder. So you can just get this placeholder. Okay, so after that, then we can pass in here a modifier. Let's make it fill max size. And we want to call this content scale.crop. For this case, we have here our image. Now let's go inside here our box. And below the box here, we can create our food image. And here basically we can pass in here the image URL. Okay, so for the content description, we can just pass it to be null. Let's put this argument on separate line. Okay, now let's pass in here a modifier. Okay, so we can fix this size to have 120 dp. Now we can pass in here the alignment, and we want to align it. Okay, so we want to align this to the bottom center, but we are getting here an error. And this is likely because we are not surrounding this together with the box. So let's just select all of this. Let's press Ctrl-Alt-J. And we want to surround this with the widget. And basically this is the box which we want. Okay, so for this case, also inside this box, I want to pass in here modifier in order to give it a particular size. So let's pass in here modifier and give it a height of 180 dp. Let's fill the max width. Okay, so we are constraining this to these particular sizes. Okay, so we have here our design ready. Okay, so our first item here is complete. So the next case, let's create here a spacer. And we can pass in here a modifier. Okay, so now we have here the text. Let's create here now, for example, that particular food item name. So let's call here so we can use here headline medium because this is just going to be a headline for that particular. Then we can pass in here modifier. We want to get here a padding. Let's give it horizontally. We can pass in here 16 dp. Okay, so we can copy this and add a little bit of a spacer. So instead of 80 dp, we can decrease it to 4 dp. And the next case, let's pass in here a text. Let's just copy this. So instead of food name, we can just pass in here a tagline. Okay, so we can make this to be a body medium and leave the padding to have similar effect. Okay, so for this case, let's navigate directly inside here. We can use our highlighted food item. So let's pass in here highlighted food item. So here we can pass in the food item. Okay, so for this case, let's go back inside here. So here we can call our highlighted food item. So let's call here highlighted food item. So instead of food item, so we can just pass in here directly. Let's pass in here the index. And for food items, basically here now we can just pass in here the food collection. And here we can pass in here the on food click. Okay, so for the part of modifier here, we can just give it a default modifier. Okay, so here we are supposed to get the food items. So we can just get these food items directly here. Okay, so we have here our food item. So we have our highlighted. Now, if this is not highlighted, then we can create a separate one, which is just a normal food. Okay, so we can just go below here. Let's create a new composable. And let's just call this food. Okay, so we pass those parameters. Let's pass in here lazy row to create these 4 different ones which are not highlighted. Let's pass in here modifier. Okay, so inside here we can easily pass in here items. So here we can get our food item. Let's create here quickly another composable that is just for the food item. So let's call this food item. We want to get just a single food item. And whenever we have an click, let's pass in here modifier. Okay, now let's create here a surface. Okay, so for the shape here, we can differentiate this. So let's use here material theme. And we want to use a medium shape. Let's pass in here the modifier. Okay, so for the padding here, we want to give it differently from start. Okay, so this is the padding which we have. The next case here, let's create here our column. Let's add here a clickable modifier. We can pass in here the on click. And for the on click here, we want to pass in the ID. So we can just call here on food click. And basically pass in the ID of this particular food item. So we can call here food item.id and get that particular food item. So here we can call our food image and pass in here the image URL. So let's call here food item.image. And for the content description, we can just pass in here null. Let's give it a little bit of elevation. So we can give a shadow elevation of 4 dp. And we can pass in here a modifier. And we can give it 120 dp. Okay, so after that, let's create here a text. And this text here, we can pass in here the food item.name. Okay, so we can give it a top padding of 8 dp. Okay, so directly here we can pass in here our food item. Let's pass in here food item. That food item, which is a composable one. So let's change this to be food items. Let's call it food item composable to differentiate it. Okay, so here we can pass in here the food item and the on food click. So we can just call here on food click. Okay, so for this case, we can directly go here and call our foods. Okay, so here we have our food collection and it's ready. So we can directly go here inside our feed. And for this case, we have our divider. Now we can just call here our food collection. Okay, let's look here. We call it a food collection. So let's just go directly here and call our food collection. And here we want to pass in. Okay, so this one is going to interfere with the food collections which we have. So let's differentiate it by calling food collection comp. Let's go to our feed here and call our food collection composable. And we can call here on food click. Okay, so basically here we have our food collection list. Okay, so here we have our food collection composable and we have already called it here. So the next case here is we can call here our food collection list. So let's call here our food collection list. So here we can pass in the food collection and also we can pass in here the filters and the on food click. Okay, so the next case here which we have already created our food list. So we can just go to our device here and as you can see we have the filter and also we have the food items which we have already created. So the next case is I want to create this destination bar and we can easily create this by creating. Let's go here inside our composable. Let's create here a new package. Okay, now let's create here a new composable, and we can call this destination bar. Okay, so inside here, I'm going to use, let's create first a little room. Let's use a center aligned top-up bar. Okay, so this one is going to ensure that the text actually is centered. Okay, so here I can pass in the colors. So we can change the colors by using the top-up bar default, and we want to use the center aligned top-up bar colors. And let's change the container color, which is that background color. So we can call here our material theme. And we can use the surface, and basically we can decrease the opacity and give it 0.5f. So it's your preference. Okay, so for the part of title here, I'm going to pass in a text. Okay, now we can just pass in here a style. Okay, so we want to align everything to the center, so the text should also be centered. Let's pass in here the overflow. And we can give it text overflow ellipses if this is going to be larger on different devices. Okay, now we can pass in here the actions. And we can give it the modifier now. And here we can pass in a divider to create a divider between contents. So for this case, let's go back to our feed. Okay, here let's pass in our destination bar. And let's pass nothing here. Okay, so here is our feed. And basically we have everything looking perfectly. So this is the private one. So we can go inside here and call our feed. We want to pass in here the food collection, so we can pass in here the food collection and also the filters and the on food click. Now everything is looking perfectly. So for this case, we can try to test this, and let's just directly go to our main activity. And here we have to pass in the modifier. Okay, so inside here, we can easily just delete these greetings, and directly here, let's call our feed. And we can just pass in here an empty lambda function in order to test this. Okay, now let's try to run this and see if everything is looking perfectly and fixed before we continue. Okay, so when we try to run our application, actually we are getting this permission denied, which we are missing an internet permission. So actually we forgot to add it. So we can just go inside here, our manifest, and inside here, we can just add this permission. So uses permission, and we're using an internet permission. Let's just close it here. Let's try to rerun again. Okay, so when we launch our application, we are getting this particular images here, and everything is working perfectly now. And as you can see here, we have this scroll effect, and basically we are loading this from our internet, and you can see. And here we have normal food items which are not highlighted. And here we have highlighted food items, and we have that dynamic gradient which is looking cool, and everything is looking perfectly as how we intended it to be. Okay, now let's try here. You can see that whenever we click here, we are getting a different fading and fading in and fading out animation in order to select these particular items. and also they are scrollable, and everything is looking perfectly. We have completed and shown successfully the feed, and everything is working perfectly. So next, let's deal with the detail of each particular item. So for this case, let's do it next. Okay, now for this case, let's create inside here our UI a new package. So we can insert here a new package. And inside here, let's create a file and call this detailed screen. Okay, now we can create here a composable, and let's call this food detail. Okay, so before this, I want to get several variables which we're going to use them. So let's create here a private variable. Okay, so these are the necessary variables which we're going to use them inside here application whenever we're building. Okay, so the first parameters which I want whenever we call this food detail here is the food item ID. So we can call here food ID, which is going to be of type long. And if we have any up presses, and this is going to return a unit. Okay, so the first case is we have to get our detail. So for this case, we can just call here foods. And inside here, our key, we can just call our snack ID, our food ID. Okay, so we can call here our food repository, and we want to get food by ID. Now we can pass in here the food ID. Also, we can just get here the related. And also we want to check this according to the food ID. Now we can call here our repository, and we want to get the related, and this one is going to be according to the food ID. And basically we can just pass in here the food ID. Okay, so everything is going to be contained inside a box. So let's create here a box. And we want to take the whole width. So we can just call fill max size in order to take all of the width and height. Okay, the next case here is we want to get the scroll and we want to understand it. So for this case, we can just call here remember scroll state. And the initial value is going to be 0. Okay, the next case is we want to create a header. So we can create a separate composable for that part. So let's create here another composable and let's call this header. Okay, let's make this private. And for our header, we are just going to make a spacer. And for our height here, we are going to give it 280 dp. And we want to fill the max width for this case. Okay, now let's give here our header. Now the next case is let's create a composable that is going to deal with the body part. For this case, let's just go below here and create another composable. Let's just call this body. Also, let's make this private. Okay, now the first case is to get the related food items. Okay, so we have our food collection. The next case here is the scroll. And we get here our scroll state. Okay, so everything is going to be inserted in a column. So we want to organize in a vertical format. Now let's give it a simple modifier. And we want to add the scroll functionality here, and we can give it the state, which is just the scroll state. Okay, so let's give it a spacer here. And here we can use our gradient to scroll spacer. Now after that, let's create a surface that is going to contain our data inside here. So we want to fill the max width, so we can pass in here modifier, and we want to fill the max width. Okay. Now we want to accommodate every spacer that is going to be available whenever we scroll, so that we can have that effects of image overlapping and also expanding and contracting. So for this case, we want to create here a spacer. Okay, so let's pass in here for the image overlap. Okay, the next case here is for the title height. And after we accommodate all of the space, so we can give it a 16 spacer. And that is going to work perfectly. Okay, now let's give here a heading that is details. Okay, let's change here our style, so we can use our material theme. And we can call here a label small. Okay, we can give it a padding. So we already gave a horizontal padding, and now everything is looking perfectly. Okay, now we can copy this and paste it here. Okay, now let's create here a variable that is called the see more, and we can use here a remember. In order to remember this, let's pass in here mutable state of, and for a case here, we are just going to pass in true in order to show this particular button. So we want to show and hide this see more button whenever user clicks it. Okay, so let's pass in here the text for that particular thing more. So let's pass in here a string resource. Okay, so let's change here our style. We can use material theme typography. And we want to use body medium. Okay, so let's give it a max line. And here it's going to depend on the see more button. So if it's available, that we give it 5. Okay, and here let's give it a horizontal padding. Okay, so everything is looking perfectly. Now let's create the button that. So we can create first the text button. Okay, so we can change the style, and we want to also change the text align, and we want to align it to the center. Okay, let's give it a specified height, and for a case we're just going to give it 20 dp. We fill the max width, and also we give it a padding at the top, and let's make it clickable. And here basically we can change the see more, and we can negate the see more variable. If it's true, then it's going to be false. Okay, so let's create here another spacer, and we can give it a height of 40 dp. Differentiate between these items. Okay, so the next case here is we can pass in the ingredients. Okay, now let's give it a spacer, and instead of 40 here, let's give it just 16 dp. Okay, so we can pass in here the ingredients list, and that is working perfectly. Now let's copy it here. And here we're going to give it 16 dp. And let's add a divider to differentiate between this data. Okay, so we have the related content. So we can just call here related. And for each item, now we have here the food collection. Okay, let's create here a key that is going to help us to examine this. Now let's pass in here the food collection. And we can use the ID for these particular purposes. Okay, so here we want to display food collection. So for this case, we can create a separate composable. Okay, so we already have here the food collection variable, so we can easily just call here. Now let's pass in here the food collection. That is just the food collection which we have. And here we can pass in the highlighted and make it be false. Okay, so now everything is looking perfectly. The next case, let's pass in here a spacer to accommodate everything. So we can pass in here modifier. Okay, so we accommodate everything. So we're giving it a padding, the navigation bar padding, and give it a height of 80 dp. So for our body content here, I think everything is actually complete. So we can safely call it inside here. And pass in here the related content and also the scroll. Okay, so the next case, we want to create here a title below our body. So for this case, we can create here another composable function that is going to help us for this case. So let's just call this title. Okay, so the scroll provider is going to return us with an integer here. Okay, so we want to get the max offset and the mini offset for our image and other things. So for this case, let's get the max offset. So we can easily use with local density in order to convert between pixel to from dp to px. So for this case, we can just call here local density. .current, and here now we can call our max title offset, and we want to convert this to pixels, so we can call to px. Okay, and for our mini offset here, so we can pass in here mini title offset. Okay, so we have our offset set there. Now let's create a column. Okay, let's give it a vertical arrangement. Okay, so we can give it a status bar padding. Now let's pass in here the offset. The first case, we want to get the scroll provider, so we can get the current scroll position. So for this case, we can just call here our scroll provider. Okay, so this is the lambda function. And after that, now we want to get the offset. So to get the offset, we have to accommodate the max offset and the scroll position for this particular one. And we want to use a cos in order to get the actual value. So we can call here cos at least, and basically we can give it the minimum offset. Okay, so we have here our offset. Now we can return that offset. So let's call here int offset. For x value, we can give it 0. And for y value, and convert this to int. So everything here is looking perfectly because the offset is going to be in float. So we are going to convert it. And this on coercing is going to help us to ensure that the value is not going to be minimum than the specified value here. So we cannot go beyond minimum offset. So for that case, we have our offset set inside our column. The next case here is to make the actual title. So let's first give it a spacer at the top. So we can pass in here modifier. Let's give it a height of 16 dp. Let's just give it a headline medium for our title first text. Okay, now let's give it a modifier, and we can give it a horizontal padding. Okay, the next case, let's just copy this text. Now here we can give it a tagline, and here let's call display medium. And also here we can change the font size. Let's give it 20 dp. Now let's pass in here a spacer. And let's give it a height of 4 dp. Okay, so the font size here is supposed to be sp, not dp. Okay, and lastly here we want to show the price. So for this case, we can create a simple function that is going to help us to format the price. Okay, so let's just go below here and create a function. Okay, and here we're going to receive the price. Price is going to be in terms of long. Okay, so here we can return our, let's use here number format. Okay, so let's just go back here, and instead we have to pass in here a price. Let's give it a height of 80 dp. Okay, so let's go inside here, and basically now let's pass in here our title. And for our food item here, we already had the food item, so just pass in here the food. Let's pass in here the scroll. Now we want to get the actual value directly here, and we have our scroll provider. So the next case which we want to build here is this image here. So we have done creating the title and the body content and other things. So the next case is creating this image, but this image here is not just a placed image. So you can see it's just collapsing whenever we scroll, and basically it aligns differently depending on different occasions. So if it's actually expanded, then it is in the center, and if it's collapsed, then it's going to be at the left. So to achieve this, we have to do some little things. So let's do this in next section. Okay, so let's just go below here and create a new composable function. So with this composable function, let's just call it image. Okay, so we want to make this private. And the first case is to get the image URL, because this is just going to be of type string. And then we have to get the scroll provider. Okay, so the first case which we want to understand here is to get the collapsing range. So the range which we are going to get. So for this case, let's just call collapse range. Okay, so we can use here our density to convert between px to okay. So for this case here, we can just pass in here the max title offset, which we want to minus also with the minimum title offset, so we can get that range. So minimum title offset, and we want to convert this to px. That's why we're using a local density here to guide us for this. The next case is to create a collapsing function. So a function that is going to help us in deciding when we are collapsing. And this is just going to range between two values. So for this case, we can create here collapse. Collapse fraction provider. So with this, we can easily now understand, for example, the scroll provider. So we want to get the scroll provider inside here. Then we want this scroll provider to be divided with the range. So we can call here a collapsing range. Now we want to coerce the values which we're going to get here between two values. So the 0 and 1, and then we can easily decide between these two values in animating it to make it more smoother whenever we are collapsing and going to from one state to another state. So for this case, we can just call here coerce in. Okay, so we give it a range from 0f to 1f. Okay, so in order to create that particular image alignment, we have to create a custom layout. And in Jetpack Compose, that is really easy in order to create this collapsing layout. So let's just go below here and create a new composable. And we can just call this collapsing image layout. Also, let's make this private. Okay, so we have to get the collapse fraction. So this is going to be a lambda function that returns a float. And we can give it a modifier. And lastly, we can get here the content, which is just going to be a composable. So okay, so we can use a layout function in order to control how we want things to be measured and placed. So for this case, we can just pass in here the content. That is going to be the content composable, and we can give it the modifier. And that is our modifier. Okay, so here we're going to receive two parameters, so we can just call this measurable. Okay, so with custom layouts, we have a three-step process, and that is we have first to measure the children, then we have to decide this layout's size, then we have to place the children, which we have. So for a case, we have first to measure, then we have to decide the size, and then we can easily place this in a certain position. So that's going to be easy with Jetpack Compose. Okay, so for our case here, we want first to check here, and what we want to check is inside our measurables. So we can first remove these squiggish lines by calling here a layout. That is going to be removing those lines. So the first case here, we want to call our measurable, and we want first to ensure that our size is going to be equal to 1. So we don't want this collapsing function to be used in more than one children, because we are not going to design it for that purpose. So for this case, we can check first if our measurable size is going to be equal to 1, and basically now we can proceed with other things. Okay, so the first case here is we want to get the collapse function. Okay, so we can call here our collapse provider. And now we have to decide between the max size, the min size, and also the width and other things. So, okay, now let's decide here on the image max size. Okay, so we can use here the minimum function. Okay, so for case here, we can call our image max size. Sorry, we call this expanded image size, and we want to round this to pixel. And the next case is we want to use the constraints, and we want to get the max width. Okay, so for the next case is to get the minimum size. So here we can just call the minimum. And instead here we want to use a max function. Okay, and here we want to use the collapse image size. And here we want to use the min width. Okay, so for this case, we have here our image mini size and max size. Okay, so you must decide between the width. So we can get here our image width. So let's call this image width. Now we are going to use a lab in order to interpolate between values. So for this case, we can just call here our image max size. Okay, so we have here the necessary items in order to decide our image. So we want first to call here our placeable. So we can use here image placeable in order to decide where we are going to place this. So for this case, we can just call this image placeable. And basically we want to select the first item and we want to measure now. Okay, so here we measure and get the minimum and max size and everything. So for this case, we can just call here our constraints. So after we measure our item, the next case here, which we want to do is to decide between the placing. So what's going to be the Y coordinate for this case? So we can create here the image Y coordinate. So we can just call here Y. Now we can just call here our lab. And basically here we want to pass in the minimum title offset. We can call the mini image offset, and we can use the collapsing function in order to decide between these. Okay, so we have here our placeable. Now we want also to decide on the x-axis. So for this case, we can just call here image x. And also here we can use our lab in order to interpolate between values. Okay, so for this case, we can decide first the constraints, and we can call here constraint.maxWidth. So the first part is we want to center this value. So if we are in a certain position that we are going to start, then we want this image to be at centered. And if not, then we can do another case that is going to be rightly aligned as we saw. So for this case, we can just call here our constraints, and we want to call here our max width. So for this case, it's going to be lightly aligned whenever we stop our scroll position. So we are going to move from these two positions. Then we can decide here our collapse function. So we can call here our collapse fraction. That is going to help us to move between these two values from 0 to 1. So when we are in a start position, or we are in a position that the user is not scrolling, then we are going to align this image to the center. As when you observe here inside our design, whenever we are inside a 0 state, you can see that our image is centered here. And whenever we scroll, our image is going to go to the right. So for this case, we have a dynamic alignment of our particular image. Now, after we decide between the position and other things, then now we can lay out things and draw them. So for this case, we have to give this we have to give the layout the width. So let's give it the width. We can just call here our constraints dot max width, and then we can give it a height, and the height is going to be image y plus the image width. Okay, so here we have to call down to px in order to give it this to be an integer. Okay, so after we finish up with that, then we can call here our image placeable, and we want to call place relative in order to decide this. So we can give it the image x and the image y. And now our constraint function is complete. Now we can directly go inside here our collapsing image layout, and let's create here, let's call here our collapsing image layout. Now we have to pass in here the scroll provider, or the collapsing provider. So we can just call here our collapse function provider directly. Okay, the next case, we can just give it the modifier. Let's give it the padding. So we already defined the horizontal padding. And also here we can give it, we can use here then in order to add another modifier. And here we want to add the status bar padding in order to accommodate everything. Now for this case, we can just call here our food image. We already defined this on the previous parts. So for this case, we can just call here our image URL, and the content description here, we can just pass in null. So for this case, let's just go directly here and call here our image. And now we can use our food and call here the image URL. Okay, so here we have to pass in the scroll. So we can pass in the position of the scroll, which we have right now. Okay, so the next case is I want to create a button that is just going to be a press. So for this case, we can just create here another composable. So here we're going to use an icon button. So the first case is we can give it a status bar padding. Then we can give it a padding. So horizontally, we can give it 16 dp, and vertically, Let's give it 10 dp. And let's ensure the size is going to be 36 dp. So here we're going to call our arrow back, and here we can just call the content description to be back. Okay, now let's go back here inside our image layout, and below here we can just pass in here an app. Here we can just call our app plus. This case here is we want to create this bottom bar here. So you can see we have this one here, and that is going to be really easy. So let's do this next. Okay, now we can just go below here. Okay, now let's create a composable function. Okay, so we can make this to be private only inside our file. And for parameter, we're just going to pass in here modifier. Okay, so we are just going to create here a state that is going to be called the count and update count. And here we can just replace this mutable int state because we're just using an integer here. Okay, so for the design, we can use here surface first in order to make it as how we want. So we can give it the modifier as the only parameter here. Okay, now inside here, let's create a column. The first case is we can give it a divider. Now we want to arrange everything inside a row format. So the first case is we want to use the vertical alignment, and we want to align everything center vertically. Okay, let's give it a modifier. So here we can use the navigation padding. Then we can give it our own padding. So we can pass in here the horizontal padding. And let's give it a height. So we can use here the minimum height to be the bottom bar height. Okay, so the next case which we want to build here is the quantity selector and also this button here, which we can just keep it in a raw format. So let's do this next. Okay, so for this case, I want to create another component, and inside here, I'm going to create a new coding class or file, and we're going to select file, and let's call this quantity selector. Now let's call this quantity selector. And give it a modifier. Okay, so inside here, we're going to arrange everything in a row. And this row, let's just pass in here modifier. That the first case here, let's pass in here the quantity. So we want this to be QTY. Let's change here the style. Okay, so for the modifier, let's pass in here a padding. And we want to give it a padding at the end of 18 dp. And we want to align this center vertically. And we want to decrease its opacity, so we can give it 0.5f of the color which is going to receive. Okay, so the next case, I want to create the icon. So you can see here our icon has like a gradient. So we can easily do this by creating a gradient tinted icon. So let's just go below here and create a new composable. And we want to call this gradient tinted icon. And inside here, let's pass in the image vector. Okay, let's give the colors, which is just going to be a list of colors. And by default, we're just going to use this. Okay, so you can use any type of colors. Okay, so the first case, I want to get the interaction sources. Okay, so here we can just call our fade in gradient border. And we want to show the border and we want to make this to be true. And here you can provide a list of colors. So you can use any list of colors which you prefer. So for a case, let's just go with this. So here we can use, for example, material theme. And for the part of shape, so we can just give it a circular shape. Okay, the next case is we want to understand if this pattern is going to be pressed or not. So we can create here our interaction sources. And for the interaction sources, we want to collect is it pressed as a state. Now we know that our state is actually pressed. Okay, so for this case, we want to get the background. We can supply a different modifier, so we can give this modifier.offset gradient background. And if it's not pressed, then we can give it another modifier here. And we can use this background here, so we can pass in material theme.color scheme. And we want to use the primary container color if this is actually not placed. Okay, so the next case, we have to use the blend mode. So let's specify here blend mode, and we can check here if the system is in dark theme. Okay, so the next case here I want to specify is the modified color. So let's call here the modifier color. And we want this to be differently when pressed and not. So for this case, I want to create a modifier. And I want to create another gradient modifier that is going to help us with this case. So let's just go directly here to our gradient. Okay, now let's create here a composable, and for a case, let's just give it a diagonal. Okay, so we want to get the list of color and also the blend mode. Now here we can just call draw with content. Okay, so the first case, we will draw the content. Then after that, we can draw a rectangle. And let's give this a brush. Okay, so now we can use here brush.linear gradient, and we can pass in here the colors in order to get that tint and the blend mode. And for our modifier here, now we can use our diagonal gradient tint. And for this case, we can give it a list of colors. So let's pass in here the colors. Okay, so if it's not pressed, then we can give it a resting state. So let's pass in here another modifier, and we can just call here our diagonal gradient tint. Let's pass in here the color and the blend mode. Okay, now after we do all of this, we can easily now create our, now let's create here the surface to contain our components. In the first case, we want to make this clickable. And we can make this to be a transparent color. Now let's just pass in here an icon. And here we can use the modifier color. Okay, so we have here our gradient tinted icon, so we can go back inside here. Okay, so let's pass in here our gradient tinted icon. So for our image vector here, we can use the icons. And here we can use the decrease item count whenever we click. And for the content description here, we can just write decrease. Okay, so for our target state here, we can use our count in order to count this. Okay, the next case, let's give it the modifier. And we can align it center vertically. Okay, let's just give it a little bit of a style, so we can change the typography. Okay, so this one is going to be our text. In the next case, let's just add another gradient tinted icon, so you can press Ctrl C. And below here, let's create another gradient tinted icon. And instead of remove here, we can just call add. And here is increase amount. Okay, so also here we can just give it this modifier similar to here. Okay, so for our quantity selector, we can just go back to our detailed screen here. For this case, we can just call quantity selector. Okay, so for our count, we can just pass in here count. Okay, so because we have here the state of count, so we can check here our count. If our count is going to be greater than 0, then we can decrease the amount. So we can just call this update count. And let's just call count and -1. And inside here, we can easily just update our count. So we can just call count +1. Okay, let's pass in here a spacer. Okay, I want to give it a weight of 1F. So we can just call here weight and call this 1F. And let's call the text here. Okay, we can align the text to the center and we want the max line to be only 1. Okay, so we have our detailed bottom bar. So let's just go back inside here and below the up press here, we can just call here our detail bottom bar. Okay, so our full detail screen is complete. So let's try and test it in order to see if everything is working perfectly. So let's just go inside our main activity. And instead of calling this feed, let's pass in here our food ID and let's give it 0 for now because we're just testing. We have not implemented a navigation system, which we're going to do it next. So for now, let's try to test and look if everything is working perfectly. Okay. So when we try to run our application, actually we're getting a null pointer exception here. And actually when we go here, you can see we are throwing here a null pointer exception if we do not find an item. And when you see here, we are starting with 2. So our ID here is not going to start from 0. So for this case, let's just go back to our main activity. And instead of putting 0, let's just give it 2. And let's rerun again. Okay, so after we run our application, we are getting this view here. And you can see the animation is working perfectly here. But only one thing is that the detail is going to intertwine with together with this particular one here. So we have to fix this. Okay, so in order to fix that, let's go inside our foot detail, and I want directly to go to our body. Now inside here, our body, I want to select everything inside this column, and let's press Ctrl Alt J, and we want to surround this together with the column. Okay, so above this column here, I want to add another spacer. The first case, I want to make this to fill the max width. And also I want to give it a status bar padding. Okay, and here we can give it a height, and here we can use the mini title offset for our case. So this one is going to add the space between that content, and everything is going to look perfectly. Okay, now let's try to rerun again and see. Now everything is perfectly aligned, so you can see here we have our detail and the price is not intertwining. The thing which I notice here is we don't have here our background and also our border. So I think we can fix this by just going inside here our quantity selector. Okay, so inside our quantity selector, you can see we are not using this background, and also we are not using this border modifier here. So what we can do here, we can just come below this clickable modifier. Let's add here dot then in order to change this modifier. Now we can change the border. So the first case, I want to clip everything. So we can just call here dot clip. And we want to clip this in a circular shape. Now we can add the border, and then we can add the background. So the order of modifiers is actually considered here. So we have to consider this also in order to get desired outcome. Okay, now let's rerun again and see the changes. Okay, so now you can see here our icons are actually having now a border and also a background. And whenever we press, you can see that we have like an animation that is going to fade in and showing us there's something that is actually happening. Okay, so the detail screen is actually working. So we have now the feed and also we have the detail screen. So now it's the right time to introduce the navigation. So in the next part, we are going to connect between the feed and also the detailed screen by using Jetpack Compose animation. Okay, so we have already created the architecture for home and detail. So the next case, we want to deal with navigation. So for this case, we can create here a new package. And let's call this navigation. Okay, now let's insert here a new content class or file. And for this class, we're just going to call this navigation. Okay, so we have to create a class that is going to hold up the screens. So let's create an enum class. Let's call this tabs because we're going to have the list of tabs. And for our tab here, we are going to have title, which is just going to be of type a string. Then we are going to have an icon. Also, it's going to be of type image vector. And lastly, we are going to have a route, which is a type of string. Now we are going to have two tabs. So the first tab is just going to be a feed. So here we're just going to call it home. And we can pass in the icons. So let's use the icons. Okay, so these are going to be our tabs. And what we want to do also is to have a variable that is going to take us to the detail screen. So we can just call this detail route. Our required data. Now the next case here is we want to create our navigation. So let's create here a composable, and you can call it whatever you want. So let's call it okay. So it seems like we did not add the Android Compose navigation, so we have to add it. So let's just go directly inside here, build.gradle. Now we can just add here an implementation. Okay, so we want to get the navigation compose. So you can use this Android X navigation. And after that, we can press Alt Insert in order to replace this with the data store navigation here. Now we have to sync our project. So our project is synced successfully. Now we can just add this import, and we want to use remember. Okay, next case is we are going to define a start destination dynamically. So because we are going to have also the onboarding screen, but for now we are just going to leave it as default. Okay, so these are the data which we are going to require for now. Okay, now we can just pass in here the nav host, and we can pass in here the nav controller and pass in the start destination. Okay, let's pass in here the composable, and for route here, best case, we are going to have our tabs. Let's go to the main activity. So we had here the feeds, and also we can just delete these. Let's just go directly inside here. Okay, so whenever we click this, we want to navigate to the detailed screen. So we can just call here our nav controller. And we want to navigate to a particular destination. So for a case, we just pass in here the route, and let's access the detail route. And what we want also to add inside here is the ID which we're going to get. So for this case, we have it as the ID, and now we can navigate to that particular composable. Let's pass in here another composable, and inside here now we can just call our detailed route. So let's just call here our detailed route. And let's tell it that we have arguments. Okay, so let's get the ID. Now here we can just rename this from. Okay, so here we want to get the string, so we can call here get a string, and basically we can pass in we want to get the ID. And if this is going to be nullable, then we can just return here the ID of 1. Okay, let's call here our food detail. Now we have to pass in here the ID. And the ID is going to be long, so we can just call here too long. And basically here now we have our food ID. Now we have the on click whenever we press this, so we can call here nav controller and call navigate up. And basically with that, we can easily now navigate from one screen to another screen. Okay, so now we can navigate inside here on main activity. Now what we can do here is delete these everything. And below this, let's create a new composable. And let's call this food. Okay, so here we can have the nav controller if we wish. Let's just increase the size. Okay, the next case, we are going to use a scaffold. So here we're required to pass in the start destination. So for a case, we're just going to start with this because we're going to make it dynamically. But for now, let's just use our tabs. And lastly, let's pass in here the nav controller, and we can give it the nav controller. Okay, so inside here, we can just call our food. Let's try to rerun again and see. So our app is launched successfully. Now let's try to click anything here and see. So we just navigated here, and you can see we have here our data. And everything is working perfectly in case of our navigation. We can click here and navigate back to where we started. And also we can just click this to go to another case, and you can see we have our data. Click back here and we are navigating back also. And here we have our data and everything is working perfectly as expected. Okay, so the next case here which we want to do is to create our cart. So we have completed the navigation and other two parts which are really essential for our app. So the next case is to build this app, this cart here. So you can see we have this data, and also we can easily just scroll here, and this is just dynamic, so we can easily just remove items and add items. You can see here the data is going to change. So let's do this next.